Shana Tova. Don't just take my word for it, or that of his parents or his grandmother, when I tell you that Sam Heller, a proud product of Park Avenue Synagogue, is a kind of young man you would be honored to call your own. Sam is a rising senior at Northwestern University. A journalism major, Sam landed a coveted internship at the Chicago Times this past summer. His summer was off to a great start, having already published a few pieces on workers' rights, the plight of undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, and my personal favorite, a deep dive into the upgrades in Amtrak's meal service. On July 8th, Sam was sent to assignment to Chicago's South Side to cover a press conference on Chicago's bike-sharing program when his life would change instantly and forever. Driving home to write his story, Sam heard shot fires in the distance, but by the time he could register what was going on, a stolen U-Haul van T-boned the passenger side of his compact blue Mitsubishi. Sam's car spun out of control at the intersection of Roosevelt and Independence. The airbags blew out, and the ambulances arrived within minutes. Sam's car was totaled. Miraculously, though, Sam walked away with just bruises from the seatbelt that saved his life. Nevertheless, as per protocol, the hospital performed a CAT scan. Thankfully, there were no signs of concussion, no signs of internal bleeding, but there was something. So the doctors decided to keep Sam overnight for an MRI and an observation. The following day, and by now Sam's folks had arrived from New York, the family was informed that a brain tumor had been found. It had been there all along, growing larger over the years. Sam had no symptoms. He never knew it was there. The family flew back to New York, and having been presented with the medical options, decided to operate immediately. It's a good thing they did too, because the tumor turned out to be even larger than the scans had indicated. The first symptoms would have been crippling seizures, followed by more perilous surgery, with the remainder of Sam's life under constant medication and vigilance. The surgery was successful. Sam's recovery, remarkable. He returned home to celebrate the August 12th birthday he shares with his twin brother, Ben. Every passing day is stronger than the one before. There's going to be a few days of radiation in December and probably an annual MRI. Most importantly, Sam is excited to get back to school senior year and living his life. And Sam, it's great to see you in shul. Physical health aside, how does Sam feel? Well, I asked him. On the one hand, not surprisingly, he's filled with gratitude. He knows that his is a story, but by the grace of God's story, if there ever was one. But what Sam also knows is that embedded in his story are more questions than answers. What if he had not put on his seatbelt that day? What if there had been a friend in the passenger seat? Or if the car had hit the driver's side and not the passenger's side? Had he been a split second ahead, Sam knows he may not be alive today. But then again, had he been a split second behind and the van had missed him entirely, then there would have been no MRI. Had there been no MRI, the tumor would have been undetected. There would have been no life-saving surgery and a cascade of unspoken scenarios. A sequence of chance events that could have gone one way or the other, events that forever altered the direction of Sam's life. An interminable series of impenetrable what-ifs. Gratitude mixed with misery and dread, all prompted by the realization that our lives can be upended at any single instant. Sam's story is a great one, but it's not just a one in a million story. It's a one of a million stories that I can tell, that you can tell, that we all can tell about the world in which we live. Life can change in the blink of an eye. In the abstract, we all know that to be the case, but stories like Sam put an exclamation point to the conditions of our existence. We're all living by a thread seated beneath the mythical sword of Damocles. In the days ahead, we're going to be observing the 20th anniversary of 9/11, a date upon which the entire world changed. If you're of a certain age, I imagine you can recall exactly where you were that day. I know that I can, holding Debbie's hand as the towers fell, our newborn child as our sense of reality came crashing down. The horror-struck awareness of the lives instantly lost and the unending grief of their loved ones. Depending on our generation, we remember where we were on 9/11, on Pearl Harbor, or when we went into lockdown. We can replay those days of infamy in slow motion, recalling them in great detail. Less remembered are the days leading up to those days, the September 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. We live our lives sleepwalking, seduced into the comforting belief that how things are is how things always will be, until that seismic moment arrives and we're shocked out of our complacency. We have no choice then but to acclimate ourselves with whiplash speed to our new reality. And needless to say, not all stories are like Sam's. Aside from being a child of the congregation, what struck me most about Sam's story, was that it happened as I was totally absorbed in the story of another Chicago college intern, Max Lewis, about whom you may have read. A rising junior at the University of Chicago, by all accounts, Max was both brilliant and an incredible mensch. Just days before and blocks away from Sam's accident, Max was commuting home from his internship on Chicago's Green Line when a stray bullet ripped through the window and struck him in the neck. For Max and his family, there would be no redemption. Max died 3 days later, a beautiful young man deprived of length of years. His parents doing the unimaginable, bearing a child. And in thinking of Max, I cannot help but consider the same sort of questions as I did with Sam. Had Max returned one more email before leaving the office that day? Had he taken a different seat than the one he did? Had he bent down to tie his shoes or check his phone, or if the train was going a touch faster or a touch slower, or Max would still be with us. You can't have it one way but not the other. For every person who was supposed to be in the North Tower or the South Tower or the Surfside Tower, but miraculously wasn't, there was someone who might not have been, but tragically was. For every CAT scan bearing good news, there's one bearing bad. Our world, it comes with no promises. It's a cauldron of chaos that can bubble over at any moment, and the trajectory of our existence rewritten at any time. Today is Rosh Hashanah, Hayom Harat Olam, the day tradition teaches that the world was created. And yet this year, it's not so much the order of creation that we feel, but the disorder, the disarray, and yes, the chaos. Good as God's creation may have been, the very first verses of Genesis assert that the world was established on a foundation of tohu vavohu, a howling and empty void. The great biblicist of our time, John Levinson, argues, as did the rabbinic midrash long before, that the biblical story of creation is not merely to describe God's hand in fashioning a majestic universe, but to draw attention to God's ongoing efforts to keep the levee from breaking, to tame the floodwaters of chaos, ever seeking to burst forth. a story about disorder, about anarchy and the persistence of evil, a world both random and erratic, a world that can be upended in any given place and at any given instant. By this telling, today, Rosh Hashanah is not so much a day to sit back and breathe in the wonders of providential design, but a day to sit up, take note, and ask ourselves how best to navigate a world that's shot through with contingency. And if there was ever a year that we are attuned to the fundamental fact of earthly existence, this chaos kampf built into creation, then this is that year. Pandemic, war, hurricane, flood, fire. There's something so very biblical about our moment. Every conversation, every plan, every budget, every email, every sermon, everything is done with a built-in contingency. Will we be working from home or the office? Will school be on campus or online? Will high holidays services be in person or virtual? How bitterly fitting is this Delta variant name, Delta, the Greek letter denoting change. Everything is changing all the time. In retrospect, last year, in all of its horribleness, was more straightforward. What can be more straightforward than a lockdown? This year, everything is in flux. My heart has been broken again and again for our children, for my children, who are just trying to do their level best to put one step in front of the other. We all feel it. I know Debbie and I do. 2 years in a row with a child spending Rosh Hashanah isolating in quarantine on a new campus. And were it just to be quarantines, canceled graduations, and rescheduled weddings, that would be difficult enough. But it's far more. It's the not knowing when one will launch their love life or their professional life, the not knowing when one will see a loved one again, the not knowing if our democracy will survive, the not knowing if there will be a habitable planet for our children and children's children to live in. It's not just that our lives have been thrown off course, it's that we've become totally unconvinced about our tomorrows, and it's taken a toll. When you aren't sure about what's going to come next, when this world, like Lucy and Charlie Brown, keeps snatching the football from under you, is it any wonder that the incidence of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicide are on the rise? The target keeps moving, and we're forced to recalibrate and recalibrate again and again. It's destabilizing, it's exhausting, and it begs the question of how we, mere mortals, can contend with a world that is at worst governed by chance and at best by a will whose wisdom will forever lie beyond our grasp. And it's a state of affairs that speaks directly to the calling of the day. For as long as human beings have been human, we have known that our lives are of limited and indeterminate length, that one day we can be here and the next day not. Isn't that the whole point of the central prayer of these high holidays, Unatane Tokef, who will live and who will die, who by earthquake, who by plague? Aside from noting how eerily up-to-date the ancient categories are, we would do well to consider the phrasing of the ancient prayer. Nobody knows the who, the when, and certainly the why of our tenure on earth. All of our lives can turn on a dime, sometimes for the better, but oftentimes for the worse. It's a theme that links all of the Torah readings and Haftorah readings together. Sarah, who is suddenly blessed with a child. Hagar, who is traumatically cast out into the wilderness and saved at the last second. This year, we are all Isaac bound on the altar, unsure if the angel will arrive in time or at all. The cast of characters of our Torah and Haftorah readings are individuals no different than all of us, who are forced to pivot over and over again. The effects of COVID may have put a spotlight on the chaotic nature of our existence, but that is a truth that these days of awe call on us to recognize every year. The realization that life can come and go in the blink of an eye, that there is an instability built into our lives, is an observation that can undoubtedly drive a person to nihilistic despair. But the theological calculus of the high holidays is very explicit. Life is precious, existence is unstable, so personal agency is everything. Who will live and who will die? No idea. But we can live our lives making each day count. We can live with the desperate intentionality that the world can be upended tomorrow. To be aware of the fragility of existence is not meant to render us powerless. It's meant to empower. We can infuse life with meaning, living in a manner that reflects an awareness that our next day could be our last. The High Holiday Prayer Book teaches us that we can take on personal agency in 3 specific ways: acts of Chuva, of repentance, acts of tefillah, of prayer, and acts of tzedakah, of righteous giving. Let's start with Chuva. At its literal level, the word means repentance, the act of seeking and granting forgiveness for the missteps of our lives. On a broader level, it signals the state of disrepair that many of our relationships are in, oftentimes due to sin, but oftentimes benign negligence. One of the most modest and moving exchanges of my past year was when I mustered the courage to tell someone whom I love very much and who I know loves me very much that I feel like I'm always the one picking up the phone and putting in the effort. For years, I had squirmed as to whether to have this conversation. And when I finally did, the guy was actually grateful for my candor. He responded with warmth. He explained he had no idea, and now he calls me every week. If you're watching, take the week off for God's sake. I have a Yom Kippur Sermon to write. But I do love your calls. Not every act of repentance involves some colossal treachery or betrayal. Some do. But more often than not, we just need to be more diligent in relationship maintenance before something really goes wrong. Acts of tshuva need to be done with an urgency, knowing that we don't know what tomorrow may bring. It was Rabbi Eliezer of the Talmud who urged his students to perform tshuva one day before their death, to which his students understandably asked, "But how can one know the day of their death?" Rabbi Eliezer clarified that a person should live their entire lives in a state of tshuva. What's the first lesson of these holidays? Life is short. Get your relationships in order. Go for a walk. Go for a talk. Pick up a phone. It's what these days are about. Don't wait until it's too late. Second, tefillah, a Hebrew word which technically means prayer, but can be more broadly defined as spiritual living. What defines a life of meaning and purpose? How am I connected to those who came before me? And what's my legacy to those who will follow? How do I balance the particularism of my Jewish identity with my universal commitments to a shared humanity? What is it that the Lord requires of me? One day, please God, soon, I'll teach a class about my favorite philosopher, Michel de Montaigne, the man who, aside from Moses, shaped my intellectual passions, the 16th century philosopher. Montaigne was going about his life when, to put it mildly, it hit a rough patch. His father had died young. He lost his younger brother in a freak sporting accident, a tennis ball hitting his head. His first child died at 2 months, and he went on to lose 4 of his 6 children. His best friend, Etienne de la Boissée, was killed by the plague, and he himself was racked with the piercing excruciations of kidney stones. Death was not some nebulous concept for Montaigne. In fact, in 1560, he was flung off his horse, and as he lay there throwing up clumps of clotted blood, Montaigne sensed himself slipping into death. But Montaigne neither died nor did he give up. He started paying attention, and he wrote. He wrote not about how to die, but about how to live, how to love, how to laugh, how to learn, to weep, to mourn, and so much more. Essay after essay on the subject of living. It's actually where the word essay comes from. The French essay, meaning to try. We die, yet we try. It's a little kitschy, but it's not an inaccurate summation of these holidays. And for those of you, those of us, who aren't great essayists or great philosophers, then make this year to elevate your spiritual living one mitzvah at a time. I've spoken about the importance of taking on a life of mitzvot many times. Get used to it. I intend on doing so as long as I have the mic. And while there are all sorts of reasons of living a life of mitzvot to connect to God, to Judaism, to the Jewish people, let me just suggest another one. To put on tefillin, to observe Shabbat, to refrain from eating from one side of the menu in favor of the other. These are all bold assertions of personal agency in the face of a world beyond our control. Don't misunderstand me. Mitzvot are not some coping mechanism in the face of chaos. Rather, they're annual, seasonal, monthly, daily, hourly reminders that every moment is capable of being infused with meaning, purpose, and sanctity. I promise you faithfully that when the Cosgrove family sits down to light Shabbos candles, the mood is anything but pristine calm. One kid is yelling at another for taking their sweet time in the shower. Debbie is wrapping up yet another phone call with yet another sibling. I'm trying desperately to finish up my Shabbat preparations, but then that moment comes when we light the Shabbat candles and we push out the bad and we bring in the good. And a daring, unspoken assertion is made that in the midst of the chaos, every deed matters and every moment is capable of being made sacred. Do not say, taught the ancient sage Hillel, when I have time to study, I will study, for you may never have time. To live a life of mitzvot is to spiritually try, to access the historic and ever-evolving Jewish toolbox by which to explore the existential questions sitting within all our hearts. All of which brings us to the third and final high holiday expression of personal agency, tzedakah, often translated as charitable or righteous giving, but it can be expanded to include the degree to which we insist that our deeds impact this world in which we live. Why was Abraham chosen to be the founder of our people? The rabbis compare him to a man on a journey who sees a birah doleket, a palace ablaze in flames. The man wonders if it's possible that the palace lacks an owner, and just then the owner of the palace calls out from the blaze and responds, "I'm the owner of the palace." And the man understands his duty to help extinguish the fire. Abraham, and by extension every Jew ever since, has a calling to respond to our world in need of rescue and repair, to put out fires wherever they are set ablaze in God's world. To live a life of tzedakah means that when we see something, we don't just say something, we do something. The effects of this pandemic have been described as the letter K, with some winners on the upswing and many suffering on the decline. If you are in a financial position to impact local agencies, national conversations, global initiatives, and yes, Jewish life, but you've yet to do so, then I ask you, what are you waiting for? This is not a rabbinic parable. The world is literally on fire. The heroes of our people, past, present, and future, have been those individuals who have leveraged whatever means are at their disposal to bend the arc of the universe towards justice. Tzedakah, righteous living, is about money and policy and politics, but it's not just about those things. Giving back is not only the purest expression of gratitude for the blessings of one's life, it's about the belief that from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, we are allotted a finite amount of time to actualize our ideals. We do so because it's a right thing to do. We do so because it sets an example for our children and our community. We do so, most of all, because we're all just here for a hot flash, and no one knows what tomorrow's going to bring, and no one gets out of this alive. So live your life as if it matters. Friends, I pray that the year to come brings peace, blessing, and calm. But I can't promise it. None of us can. To be a rabbi, to be a pastor, is to live with a profound and pounding awareness of the precious and precarious nature of life. Indeed, when I spoke to my dear colleague, the Hillel rabbi at the University of Chicago, about Max Lewis, it was she who reminded me about what I had read in the papers. Max did not die immediately. Struck in the neck by a bullet, Max was rushed to the hospital, and having suffered a high spinal cord injury, though he regained consciousness, he couldn't talk, he couldn't use his arms and legs, he couldn't eat, and he couldn't breathe except with a ventilator. As for communication, a speech therapist was brought in with a letterboard. Max's only movement, his eyelid, 1 blink meaning yes, and 2 meaning no. The doctors explained to Max the severity and irreversibility of his condition. This would be a matter of when, not if. His friends prayed outside the room. His family stood at his side. 1 blink at a time, Max communicated to his mother by way of the letterboard. I'm ready to die. I'm ready to go home. Please pull the plug. I can't live this way. The Shema was recited. Max's final act in this world, the empowered choice to determine the terms of his death. A blink of an eye. That's all it takes. The difference between life and death. The question we face today, however, it's not how we want to die, but it's how we want to live. Each one of us can endeavor to make empowered choices regarding the terms of our existence, to live with an urgency, intensity, agency, and joy, yes, joy, in accordance with the fleeting, indeterminate, and precious nature of the gift of life. To laugh, to love, to give, to forgive, to learn, and to do for us, for those no longer with us, and most of all, for those whose futures are yet to be written. Shana Tova.